I want to thank all the brave souls who I've seen now for a couple of hours here, learning, sitting still, moving with Julie Emden. Julie, I really loved the movement. Torah is so embodied, and to have the chance to move and feel and breathe with Torah, not just think and talk about Torah, is a valuable part of any Shavuot experience, any Jewish experience, and I really appreciate it. But I kept my camera off because nobody should see me dancing. That was just something I had to put out there. You know, if you've seen Barney, you've seen me dancing, and there's no need to go into more detail than that. I'm going to share a link. I'm going to be sharing my screen in a minute, but I'm also putting in the chat a link to this source sheet on Safaria that I'm using for tonight's talk. And so if it's easier for you to look at that, you can go ahead and look at that. I want to take a second to just acknowledge that we're learning this Shavuot under radically different circumstances than we might ordinarily do. Ordinarily, we get together in community physically. We'd learn with people in a space with those people, maybe, maybe not, but more likely. And we'd feel the presence of each other. We'd be in the presence of a physical Torah. We'd have the opportunity to hug people and experience the joy that Shavuot really engenders and encourages. It's a little harder to do that this year. We probably all know someone who's been affected perhaps seriously by the pandemic, by COVID-19, the virus, by feelings of alienation and distance from people that we care about. The fact that you are all here, I want to thank you for and hold you for, because it's a movement toward life on your part, and that's a movement that we all need to be making at this point. I also want to just say that in talking about the mixed multitude, I've been thinking a lot about what the erev rav, what the mixed multitude really is, and who it is, not only outside of us, but inside of us. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I also want to say that these times are difficult, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the deaths of innocence that we see before us each day. And I would like to dedicate this teaching to the memory of George Floyd, who was killed in Minneapolis, killed on video, slowly and horribly, and say that in his memory, I want to teach about the mixed multitude as something having to do with the persistence of love over hate, the persistence of inclusion over exclusion, and the persistence of knowledge over ignorance. So in that spirit, I'd like to dedicate the learning to him, and I'd like to begin tonight. So let's look at the source sheet, and I'm going to go ahead and share my page and scroll up to the top here. So first of all, little piece of trivia. Did you know that microorganisms in our body outnumber our human cells by 10 to 1? Did you know that? Did you know that we're basically giant megalopolises of germs and viruses building a giant scaffolding onto which our human cells are kind of clinging and weaving through? In other words, we are a mixed multitude. And even though those organisms, those microorganisms, outnumber our human cells 10 to 1, because they're so small, they're only 2% of our body weight. But we are a multitude. As Walt Whitman said, we contain multitudes. And because of that, we have to think of the erev rav that went out with the Israelites, the mixed multitude, as something that is both novel and familiar, something that is both included and different, and something that is both threatening, potentially, seen that way in our sources, potentially threatening, and potentially very salutary and very healthy and invigorating for the Israelite society that goes fleeing from Egypt. So the first text that we're going to look at is from Exodus 8. The reason we're looking at this text is because it contains the word arov, which is very similar to the word erev, which is the word for the mixed multitude, the erev rav. We'll talk a little bit about the etymology of these words. But here the word occurs in the highlighted version I'm showing you. And the English says, so Moses has unleashed a series of plagues, and this one is the plagues. We don't even know exactly what it is. It's either insects or beasts. It's usually translated as swarms of insects, basically locust-y type things. And we're seeing that Moses is saying to Pharaoh, when I leave your presence, I will plead with the Lord that ha'arov, the swarm of insect, will leave. Visar ha'arov mi paro mi avadav ume amo, will leave Pharaoh and his courtiers and his people. And then Moses adds, but let not Pharaoh act again deceitfully, not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So we get from this use of the word of the three-letter word ayin resh vet, arov, we get that it's some kind of swarming, uncontrollable thing. It's either beasts or insects, but it is a multitude and it cannot be controlled. Here's the key verse about who goes out with the Israelites from Egypt. This is from Exodus 12:38. V'gam erev rav ala itam v'tzon uvakar mikne kaved me'od. Moreover, a mixed multitude, erev rav, went up with them, with the Israelites out of Egypt. And then it adds, and a lot of livestock and flocks and herds. So there again, there's a feeling of just a swarm. And if you can place yourself in your imagination at that moment, you can imagine that after the death of the firstborn and the profound chaos that erupts in Egypt, everybody who wants a chance to get out of Egypt is going to take that chance to get out of Egypt. The rabbinic sages spend a fair amount of time thinking about, well, who were these people? And they draw a connection between the erev rav in Exodus and this next story from Numbers 11:4, the Asaf-suf, the riffraff. This is when they're about to have quail dropped on them because they're lusting after meat. And the Torah says the riffraff in their midst felt a gluttonous craving. And then the Israelites wept and said, if only we had meat to eat. So what's important here etymologically? Why am I boring you with these stories? First of all, erev rav only appears once in Torah, right here. Asaf-suf only appears once in Torah, in Numbers. The rabbis look at these two words that have sort of that duplicative sound, erev rav and Asaf-suf, and decide these are the same people who are causing all this trouble. The same people who sort of latched on opportunistically to get out of Egypt with the Israelites are the same ones who lust after meat in the desert. The rabbis also decide, of course, that these are the people who are responsible for the sin of the golden calf. So right away, early on in rabbinic tradition, we see a concern with who's Israelite and who's not, who belongs and who doesn't. Now, the rabbis have a lot of teachings that are both welcoming and positive about the erev rav, and many teachings that are not. For example, the mystic Isaac Luria, who was in exile from Spain and lived in the town of Sfat and was the great expositor, the medieval expositor of Jewish mysticism, said that he could tell which of his students were from the erev rav. Because the rabbinic idea was not that the erev rav was some sort of genetic group that came, that had some sort of other genetic mix. The erev rav took on a mystical meaning. And the mystical meaning that it took on was that in every generation there are seeded people from the erev rav, from a soul orientation that is mischief-making, that is egotistical, that is gluttonous, that is craving, and you can spot them a mile away. I'm sure we can all think about people in our lives, and maybe in our national life, who act that way. People who make it all about themselves. People who want to make sure that they have more than everybody else. People who want to make sure that they're praised and glorified. To early rabbinic sages, that is the mixed multitude. So David Alter, who's a great scholar of Jewish religion, says these words that have this duplicative sound, erev rav, asaf suf, they're denigrating. These are denigrating words. So when you see them, you know that you're dealing with somebody who is of a negative influence. But I'm scrolling down here, and now I want to show you a text from Exodus Rabbah, the book of rabbinic midrash on the book of Exodus, that has something very different to say. It says, the proper ones of Egypt, hakesharim sheba mitzrayim, the proper ones of Egypt came and made a Pesach sacrifice with the Jews and went out with them, as it is stated, and also a mixed multitude went out with them. So here we see a very different kind of view. The view that the erev rav comprises people who want to live the life that the Israelites are living, want to worship the God that the Israelites worship, who are kosher, hakesharim, who basically want to do the proper things, make the Pesach sacrifice, leave the land of Egypt, so that they can become one with the people who will be receiving Torah. So here is a source that tells us, and I didn't write down what the source is, but this is from Rashi, actually, who believes, among others, that the erev rav was all the sorcerers of Egypt. When they saw that Moses could do magic that they couldn't do, they wanted to get out, and they wanted to get out with the people who could do the really good magic. But their magic came in handy too. Where? When it was time to make the golden calf. Rashi says, once Aaron threw the gold that was collected from all the people into the furnace, the wizards among the mixed multitude that had come up from Egypt turned it into a calf by magic. Here again from Exodus, the Midrash says, a wonderful book interpreting Midrash from Parshat Bo, says the Israelites were joined by the erev rav, which were the best of the Egyptians. Although God had counseled Moses against accepting them as converts, Moses insisted. He argued with God, these people have witnessed your great strength in Egypt. Excuse me. If they accompany us, they'll experience additional miracles, and they'll fully comprehend that there is no power besides you. This Midrash goes on to say, Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, was among those who joined the Exodus, and that she entered the land of Israel, as did all the women of that generation, because it was only the men who sinned and died in the wilderness. And moreover, she was one of the 9 righteous people who were taken to the Garden of Eden alive. What does this tell us? What does this mean? I think part of what it means is a recognition on the part of rabbinic sages that the desire to be pure and to exclude, while it has been the basis, the foundation of the priestly system of the Israelites, also has the danger of excluding people who are supremely good for society, people who join the society by choice, people who feel in their neshama that they belong with this group. Their recognition, in other words, that the priestly goal of separating pure from impure, which is really what the book of Leviticus, which we've just finished, is all about, the job of separating pure from impure can give a false sense of superiority and exclusivity that is damaging to the body politic and to the cultural body as a whole. So there's one other group, among others, that we don't have time to talk about, that the sages detect in this language that might be give us a hint as to who the erev Rav actually is. So it could be, and this comes to us from texts in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that the erev Rav refers to some sort of group of mercenaries. So in other words, in Egypt at the time, there were lots of slaves from different cultures, lots of soldiers, not only an Egyptian sort of army, as it were, but mercenaries from different cultures that helped maintain the security of the state. Some of these people may have been involved in overseeing the slave labor in Egypt. And when the Exodus happened, a lot of these mercenaries had the chance to make a break for it. To the rabbis, this answers the question, when Israel gets attacked by Amalek, when they have battles in the desert, weak and hungry as they are, how are they even able to go into battle? One potential answer is that the erev Rav is a bunch of people who know how to fight, who have the experience, the tools, the weapons, and the ability to wage battle. And that might be part of who the erev Rav is. So from a stepping back and from a sociological perspective, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when a society is destabilized. I'm going to take a sip of water, Marco Rubio style here, excuse me. When a society is destabilized, what happens? It not only looks for solutions about how to attack the root of its instability, but typically it also looks for people to blame and marginalize who are potential or able to be perceived as sources of that instability. So when the incident of the golden calf happens, for example, the sages of the rabbinic era are quick to draw a line between the erev Rav and those who want to return to idol worship because it's familiar and perhaps even comfortable. The rabbis, though, don't forget, are casting this interpretation back into the text from a considerable remove. Furthermore, the book of Exodus is basically a priestly document written over centuries and probably completed somewhere between the 4th and the 6th century before the Common Era. And at that time, the priests were writing documents, were writing into ancient history and myth, storylines that help perpetuate their power as the ritual, cultural, economic, and spiritual center and taproot of Israelite society. So you have the priestly document reflecting a priestly point of view, and you have the rabbis several centuries later interpreting that point of view as people who are trying to reconstruct a culture in utter crisis, a culture without its ritual center. To such a people, describing and defining who the erev Rav, who the mixed multitude is a matter of life and death. But they don't only do it going forward, they do it going back to try to identify a pattern that they can then take forward into history. The problem, though, is that everybody received Torah, right? The mixed multitude stood at the base of Sinai just as the Israelites did. And it's important, if we go down and look at a couple of these sources in some of the time that we have left, to realize that it is while the priestly class and the rabbis are very keen to know who was descended from Abraham and who wasn't, that the idea is that the ethical descendants of Abraham are the important people, not the genetic descendants of Abraham. This is from the Talmud, Beitzah 32b. This is a story about a rabbi who comes from Palestine to Babylonia. After the destruction of the Second Temple, Babylonia becomes the serious center of rabbinic enterprise, learning, and creation of canonical text. But Shabbatai bar Marinus went to Babylonia and got a rude welcome. Shabbatai bar Marinus came to Babylonia. He requested their participation in a business venture, they being the rabbinic class in Babylonia, to lend him money and receive half the profits in return, and they didn't give it to him. Furthermore, when he asked them to sustain him with food, they refused to sustain him. He said, "These wealthy people are not descendants of our forefathers, but they came from the mixed multitude. It is as it is written, and show you compassion, and have compassion upon you, from which it is derived, anyone who has compassion for God's creatures, it is known that he is of the descendants of Abraham. And anyone who does not have compassion for God's creatures, it is known that he is not of the descendants of Abraham, our father." For Philo of Alexandria, a wonderful Hellenistic Jewish philosopher and thinker in Egypt just before the Common Era, he wrote about the life of Moses, and he was in sort of polemical engagement with Egyptian historians who were saying, you know who the Israelites were? You know who Moses was? These Egyptian historians were saying Moses was a leper. The plagues that Moses inflicted on Egypt were plagues that his people caused. And the Egyptians had to kick him out so that they could get rid of this impurity. Philo of Alexandria, being Jewish, pushes back very forcefully on these ideas, as does the ancient historian Josephus, and talks about the nobility of Moses and the Israelites. But he also talks about it from an ethical and philosophical point of view. And he says that inside each of us is an erev rav. These are the aspects of each of us that crave temptations and keep us under the dominion of our passions and unable to resist the sway of seductive and ill-conceived modes of thought and action. Before I ask for some input from you, I just want to leave you with this wonderful quote from Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim, which has some of my favorite rabbinic names in all of Jewish literature. So Avraham Chaim of Zlotchov asked his rabbi, Rav Shmelki of Nicholsburg, that's a wonderful name. This is a quote from the Covenant Code in the book of Leviticus: "Love your rea, your neighbor, as yourself. Ahavta l'reacha kamocha." How is one to love an evil one? In other words, if your next door neighbor's horrible, maybe he's part of the mixed multitude. Maybe she's one of the bad ones. How are you supposed to love such a person? Rav Shmelki says to his friend, the Torah commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves. But how can I do this if my neighbor has hurt me? And the answer is, it means love your neighbor like something which you yourself are. Love your neighbor like you. For all souls are one. Each is a spark from the original soul, and this soul is inherent in all souls, just as all souls are in all parts of your body. That's an amazing idea. All souls being in all parts of your body harkens back to the idea that we are a towering village of microbes, germs, and oh yes, by the way, some human cells thrown in for good measure. To love the neighbor as ourselves is to understand that the neighbor is composed of the same things, the same biological elements, the same chemicals from the hearts of stars that make up ourselves. We burst out of the same universal energies. So this means that we have to see ourselves as fellow strangers with everyone we meet. We have to see ourselves as containing the seeds of our own destruction, but also the seeds of our own renewal. And so does our neighbor. We have to love them for that. But we also have to be vigilant that the cravings, the lustings, the comfort with hatred, the prejudices to which we are all too often susceptible, they are susceptible to as well. So I just want to ask you to leave in the comments, if you would, share with me, share with all of us, what is your erev rav? What is your mixed multitude? What is your inner mixed multitude? What is the mixed multitude with which you struggle right now? Is it internal? Is it, in fact, ideas of self-loathing, feelings of depression and isolation? Or is it feelings of visceral anger and possibly even hatred for people whose ideas, orientations are different from yours? Has someone seeded something in you that causes you to lean toward a vulnerability, to crave vengeance, to crave the suffering of others, to crave what is, in essence, the causing of illness on someone else? In this time of pandemic, the erev rav gives us a new opportunity to think about who goes out with us towards Sinai, who comes with us to learn Torah, who helps us, and who, by not helping us, gives us the chance to boost our spiritual immune system so that we can rise to the challenge of creating a society in which even those who are radically different will be welcomed among us. No, I don't mind if anyone gets unmuted if they want to ask a question. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or complaints?
Great, so Nancy, you're unmuted. You had a comment or question?
Nancy?
Nancy? You may still have to unmute yourself on your end.
So while we're waiting for Nancy, I want to acknowledge Howie's comment that in light of recent events with George Floyd, she's feeling conflicted because as a woman of color, she cannot escape the anger. I think that's a really important observation. And I think one of the lessons that we can take from the erev rav is that anger can be righteous and can be holy, and anger can be addictive. If this is a truism, but if anger leads to the inclusion of others in making change, then anger is holy. If anger is the inclusions of others only in circles of blame, then anger is not holy. And that is why I pointed to the rabbis as saying these people were the erev rav, they're beneath us, as being something that can tip us into elitist thinking. And that's why it was so important, I felt, to bring other rabbinic ideas that said exactly the opposite. But I want to thank you for sharing that. And I understand Brianna's comment too about anger toward the police officers who basically committed murder and wanting to cause vengeance upon those people. At this time, when we are literally receiving Torah, Torah is being received in each moment. Right now, we are receiving instruction, and we have to sit deeply and calmly, even though it seems like a contradiction term, sit calmly with our anger and discern what it instructs us to do. And if it causes us to bring into our circle people that we could not include before because of our pre-existing preconceptions about them, then we must look more deeply into the text of their being and our anger. Julie, I see I'm pretty much out of time.
If there are more comments and questions, and if you're open to it, we have some time before the next speaker. So
okay.
You can take
I see a question. Stu wants to know, how do we love our neighbor if our neighbor is evil? Hypothetically. So it's a wonderful question. And the key word of the question is love. What constitutes loving the neighbor? I don't really have time to go into what the rabbis say about this. But loving the neighbor does not mean that we automatically think that everything about them is wonderful and we want to hug them. Love in the Bible doesn't happen really until Isaac loves Rebekah. That is the first love between a man and a woman in the Bible. And love is not a feeling necessarily, but is a commitment to draw someone into your circle of engagement and keep them there. If you can think about love that way, then ideas of love in the Jewish and Christian traditions make a lot more sense than thinking, oh, I'm commanded to feel a certain way. Guess I'm going to squint my eyes and try really hard to feel that way. Hannah says, well, I'm loving all these comments. Hannah says, in the Midrash I shared, God is the one who seems to be pushing this exclusionary conception of purity. And it's only because Moses argues for the inclusion of the erev Rav that they're allowed to remain. That is a really interesting point, Hannah. And I think one thing that Midrash is constantly engaged with is the idea that people can push back against God and preconceptions of God. In other words, we have preconceptions of God, but God also has preconceptions about us and about the world. Abraham's ability to argue with God shows that God has something to learn about human beings. And the Midrash teaches us that over and over again. I just want to take this chance to say, to one more question I want to address really quickly too, maybe. Sherry says, how do we love our personal modern day Egyptians? And Lamont says, how does our neighbor love us? Those are two really interesting and very deeply related questions. How does our neighbor love us is something that we can't ultimately take responsibility for, except by deeply exploring ways in which we might love them, and our love not being conditioned on how they treat us in return. Jules makes a really interesting point. Isn't it anger like this that Moshe was punished for when he hit the rock? A wonderful, intriguing question. Maybe next Shavuot we'll learn about Moses hitting the rock, because there lie a whole plethora of lessons about the pitfalls of pride and the human desire to wrest entirely from the hands of God what our fate is going to be. I hope that you'll all take this as Torah, not meaning Torah mi Sinai, but meaning instruction, life lessons, something to chew on. When we receive Torah in today's world, we receive it from each other. And in doing so, we welcome each other into the realm of the family of Israel. We broaden the family of Israel to include the mixed multitude of our thoughts and our emotions and our fears and our lusts. And it is in this way that we get closer to God and closer to the text. Thank you all very much, and Chag Sameach.